Welcome back to the third week on how to turn your snapshots into photographs. And this week we're going to do two things. We're going to review the shutter, iris, and ASA settings from last week, and then we're going to dive into depth of field. How do I make sure everybody's in focus or hardly anybody's in focus? First part is going to be reviewing just the triad of the camera, and that is the ISO, the aperture, or the shutter. The ISO or the ASA tells you how quickly the image can be captured. The lower the number, the lower the ISO number, the longer it takes to capture an image. The higher the ISO number, the more quickly you can capture an image. The lower the ISO, the higher the quality of the picture. The lower the ISO, what am I doing here? The lower the number of the ISO, the higher the quality. The higher the number, even though you can record pictures faster, you lose quality. We'll talk about that later. The aperture, you remember, is the opening. It tells you how open the hole is that's letting light in. That's how big the window is that's letting light in. The bigger the hole, the more light that gets in. And the third thing is a shutter. That's how quickly you take your picture. It tells you how long the hole, the iris, stays open to let the light in. Now the interesting thing here is that you change the ISO. If you've got your camera on automatic or program mode where the computer in the camera adjusts everything, you change the ISO, it'll change the aperture or the shutter. You change the aperture, it'll change the shutter or the ISO. You change the shutter, it'll change the ISO or the aperture. In other words, these things are all related. Change one and it affects another. So what it means, number one, how bright the subject is controlled by, in other words, how much light this lets in, is number one, the lens opening of the iris, the time it is open for, which is the shutter, and the speed the image is recorded, which is the ISO or ASA. Now on your camera, the lens opening, as you might remember, is referred to the A or the AV, and that if you turn your little dial on your camera to select A or AV, it means, okay, the cameraman is going to lock in how big the opening is. What does that mean if you lock in the opening to a particular size? In other words, it doesn't change at all. It means as the light changes, the camera will automatically adjust the shutter, the time, or the ISO, the speed that the image is recorded. The time that the camera is letting light in is controlled by the shutter, which is S or T on your camera, and you should have found those last week. So if you put your camera on shutter priority, that means you tell the camera and lock in how fast it'll take a picture. Then as the light changes, more light or less light, the shutter doesn't change. Rather, it'll open up or close the iris, or in some cases it'll change the ISO. In most cases, the shutter will affect the aperture and the aperture will check the shutter. Those are the main two. Though sometimes on automatic cameras, if there's not enough light, the camera will automatically, if you've got your camera set this way, change the ISO to adjust for low light conditions. Finally, hope you haven't got a headache yet, the film speed, or the speed at which the image can be recorded on your camera, is referred to as the ISO or ASA. And if you look at that little switch on your camera and you push that button in and turn one of your little knobs on your camera, you'll see that the ISA will change from maybe 100 to 200 to 400 to 800. The better cameras, the ISO will go way, way high up. Mine goes to 2400 or 24,000. 24,000. That means it doesn't take much light to catch a picture, but the picture resolution is not all that great. So the point here is, when is auto not enough? When should I probably turn my camera on aperture or shutter priority or manual mode? Number one, when the lighting is difficult. In other words, it may be backlit or there's funny lights going on that might fool the camera. Number two, you might want to control who's in focus and who isn't in focus, or if there's runners, like there's a sports event, stopping action, so that controls the shutter speed. Third one is, sometimes you just want to experiment, muck with your camera, see what'll happen. And I do that lots just for play, to see how things turn out in unique situations. So in this particular here, this was a fairly dark subject, and the camera would have overexposed that. It would have left the lens open a long time trying to make. Remember we said last week, the camera tries to turn black to gray and white to gray. In a picture that has half light and half dark, the picture will turn out just fine. But a picture which is mostly dark, in this particular case the rocks were dark and the eagle was dark, it would have overexposed that picture and made it too bright. I also did want to control the background. See how blurry it is? By moving the camera and having it on a slow shutter speed, it blurred. But moved the camera with the bird. The bird was pretty sharp, but the background was blurred. And you can tell the background was blurred by, if you look underneath the wings just behind, see those little white lines? That's water coming off the bird's wings, falling in the air and being blurred by the camera movement. Isn't that interesting? This particular picture, it was shot into the sun. And so what would happen if you're shooting into the sun? Well, that would be very bright, but it was probably too bright for the camera, so it'll probably close the iris down to try and make it more average gray. Actually, the color gray is much like the background of the slide. And you can see how the color gray is a little bit darker than the overall average light in this picture. So when shooting that one, I had to, actually I put it on manual and open up the iris to let more light in, so it turned out like this. Another way you can do that is, see how that white light's on the far left-hand side? You can move the camera over so it's just showing the sky and the land, and see where the reading is on your camera. Put your camera on manual mode, lock it in, reframe it back with the sun in the picture, and take your picture, and it'll turn out just fine. So capturing variables. This is now, hopefully you don't have a headache yet, but we'll see what happens here. Lightness or darkness. How do I control it on my camera? Well, sometimes I just put my camera on manual mode and adjust the settings based on the little light meter that's in the camera, which we showed you in class, and I can show you again if you can't find it. Or on most cameras, many cameras, there's a little plus minus sign, little button you push in. When you push the plus or minus button in and you turn your little toggle switch, what you can do with your camera is tell the camera, okay, instead of taking a normal picture, I want you, if you put it on the plus side, to leave the shutter open a little bit longer, or open up the iris a little bit more. Or if you push it on the minus side, take a picture a little bit quicker than normal, and then the camera will automatically make those changes for you. If you do that, for example, this picture here with the sun right in my eyes, which obviously I had to leave the iris open a little bit longer to get enough light in there, and you forget that you did that, when you go back and take a normal picture, it'll tend to make those changes for all your other pictures too, and kind of muck those up. So if you do use your plus or minus button to change for a certain setting, make sure you put it back to 0 if you're going back to regular pictures. Number 2, what's in focus? Depth of field. Now, what controls depth of field? We'll show you in the next series of slides. But the iris opening, how open it is or closed it is one way to control the depth of field. So if I have the iris wide open and I focus in on that grass on the foreground, then the background will be out of focus. Worked really well here. You may not like the picture, but I do. And we'll teach you more about depth of field in the next video. Stop, action, or blur. Let's say there's some movement going on here. Here I wanted to have the subway cars moving, but I didn't want to have the people moving. So slow shutter speed to allow the blur to occur with the subway, which is moving quite fast. And so I put on shutter priority, and I think I left it for maybe a 1/30th of a second, handheld, 1/30th of a second. That stopped the people action, didn't stop the little blur in that girl's little funny dress there, but it did stop most of the action, but it allowed the background to be blurred. To stop that subway in the background, I'll probably have to shoot around 1/1000th of a second. In this particular case, I wanted to stop the action here with, see the sea line going in the water, so I had to use 1/1000th of a second or more to stop that. And so I put on shutter priority again, set it on 1/1000th, and automatically the light will adjust by allowing more light in to accommodate the fast shutter speed. And perspective, that's caused by lens choice, or zooming in or zooming out, or where you hold your camera. In this particular picture, I wanted everything in focus, so in this case I used a wide angle lens. A wide angle lens has lots of depth of field as opposed to a telephoto. In this particular case, I held the camera right on the ground and looked up, and it came with a nice great depth of field. So, here's one more example of that. Again, this is a low shutter speed, a small iris to keep the depth of field from the background to the foreground. And it's not a great example, but it's one more example of that. Now, this is also a high dynamic range picture, so it looks a little fuzzy. because it was a handheld HDR, and that's 5 pictures of the same subject taken at the same time, but with different exposures. Some dark, some light, and you blend them all together. I was new at this back in those days, so this one isn't quite as sharp as most of the ones I do now, but that's for a different talk. So here we go now. So if you look at your pictures and you say my picture is too light or too dark, take a look at this picture. How would you fix that? Well, your camera thinks that that's a perfect picture, but you know that it isn't, so it's letting too much light in. So you have to use your exposure compensation and put less light in, so you put it to maybe -1 or -2. Or put your camera in manual and use your little camera light meter to make sure that's metered correctly. Same thing's happening here, except it's underexposed, it's too dark. So you've got to use a little plus or minus things. Put it to +1 or +2 to allow more light in, so this picture is properly exposed. Depth of field, some people are out of focus. Where's that little picture here? Look at the people in the middle are in focus, but the woman at the front and the woman at the back are out of focus. You may like that, but I didn't like that. I actually changed that picture, took another one. So the way you can fix that is back up. If you're further back, there's more depth of field for those people. Or close down your iris, have it a smaller little hole. Again, we'll show you that in the next video. And that's how you fix that one. Or you could change your lens, use a wider angle lens. The wider the angle of the lens, like maybe a 12 millimeter, 24 millimeter, the greater the depth of field. Stop, action, or blur. People are moving. I took this picture of my son's graduation. You notice everything's out of focus. You know what's causing that? Camera shake. My hand's moving. Not good. So I have to control that by increasing the shutter speed. And this last one here is people don't get what the subject is. That I used too wide angle lens. What's going on there? Too much, too messy. I should probably walk closer and get those people on the stage as a dominant part of the picture, and then use the people on the background as a background part of the picture, or maybe just change my lens. So I think that's about it. No, I think I'll stop right here. So good luck, and we'll get ready for your next video. Take care.